Welcome to On Rails, the podcast where we dig into the technical decisions behind building and maintaining production Ruby on Rails apps. I'm your host, Robby Russell. In this episode, I'm joined by Jean Boussier, Senior Staff Engineer at Shopify. We cover Ruby threads, global VM lock, and what it really means to be I/O bound. Jean explains how to measure performance more effectively and why fast can mean a lot of different things. We also talk about gem dependencies, why it's worth reading the source code, and how to treat them like you're part of your own code base. Jean reflects on his work on Rails core and shares advice for developers who want to understand the system beneath the framework. Jean joins us from Paris, France. All right, check for your belongings. All aboard. Jean Boussier, we're so glad to have you join us on Rails. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I have to ask, what keeps you, dare I say, on Rails?
That's a good question. I guess I'm deeply happy with Ruby. Like, it's the language first and foremost. I really like how Ruby is very little ceremony, just get straight to the point and all that. And I think Rails somebody that even further. And simplicity, I know that might seem weird to some people. Rails is maybe a bit more complex than they would like. But there's in some parts of the Rails, especially the one I work the most with, which is like active record, active support, action controller. It's really straight to the point. There's really not that many layers. You directly get to it. I'm much less familiar with like the more modern things like Hotwire and things I never really used. I still write web apps like it's 2008 or something. I'm a bit...
Do you think of yourself as like a backend developer then? Do you still use that?
Not really. I mean, to be very honest with you, for the last almost 10 years, I'm mostly doing system programming, as in like really doing like all the underlying architecture things. I barely write any applicative code except in like developer tools like deployment or things like that, which sometimes happen to be Rails apps. But so there's a bit of that, but yeah, most of my time is on infrastructure.
I can appreciate the thinking about how Ruby, there's not a lot of ceremony. Like, what sort of experience did you have prior to Ruby? Like, what was that transition period for you? Or was Rails the entryway to Ruby?
Right. Yeah, it very much was. Like, I did a bit of a stint in PHP, no framework. Everyone's uploading stuff through FTP and asking everyone, like, did you modify this file? This sort of thing. It was a bit crazy, to be honest.
Okay.
Then I had like short stint with Django in Python, which is in many regards similar to Rails, but also quite different. But it's still in the same category of framework. And then I finally got a job with Rails and never moved on from it. I just stick with it because that was exactly my thing. I mean, I have millions of critiques I could make, but overall, that's really what I prefer. And yeah, like no ceremony, as in like you don't. It's not just the language, but there's also a culture, with the autoloader and everything, to get out of the way things that are always the same. Don't like the word. Don't repeat yourself, which is not just about like factorizing code or whatever, but it's just like don't do the obvious thing. Like let the system do it for you, kind of idea. Like focus on what's important.
I remember that era. For me personally, pre-Rails, where I was doing a lot of PHP and some things with Python and Perl and stuff as well. But every project that I worked on, because usually it was projects that other people had worked on, it was always like, okay, what did that team or those developers decide that they were going to use this time? And it was always different, right? And so it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but I didn't know what I was missing out on until I was kind of like, I'm like, oh, they made all these decisions for me and I can just focus on building this web application and I don't have to. Maybe this project will use Smarty for PHP templates or whatever the thing was at the time.
Yeah, it was a Wild West. I mean, I think I'm not really aware of what modern PHP look like. I think they have like a few frameworks they mostly focus on. So it's probably very different nowadays. But back in the day, that was the Wild West.
Kind of keep an eye on like things like Laravel and stuff like that. So I'm curious about your work at Shopify in particular. So you work on the Rails infrastructure team. So First of all, what does Rails infrastructure mean for those listening?
Right. I think it's infrastructure in the sense of all the bricks Shopify developers use to build Shopify. So we're not working on the product, as in like we're not gonna, add a button that does something in the UI or whatever. We're more as in looking at like the performance of the framework, making sure it's up to date, making sure it makes your developer productive, figuring out bugs when there's some, all this sort of thing. So, and also develop a lot of tooling around it. So for example, like one thing my team has been doing is like some sort of automated way to upgrade Rails. So because we have famously we have a big monolith, but we also have like a whole slew of much smaller app, some internal, some more external. And so every time there's a new Rails release, there's like hundreds of apps to upgrade. And so there's various tools to just make 80-90% of the work for you, and developers can just like finish the rest and manage the thing. That's what we mean by tooling. It's just really like try to improve productivity of developers, basically. Like tooling is not necessarily a very generic tool. It can be very specific to whatever you're doing, but it's automate and improve productivity of people.
I think that probably is very different than a lot of, say, listeners and their product teams are able to do, because maybe they're not as large of an organization like Shopify. I'm curious, like, do you spend more of your time focused on code, or do you spend a lot more time working with other teams or kind of heads down in the internals themselves?
Yeah, I'm on a different time zone than most of the company and things like that. So I end up just going havoc on whatever things. And I try to, like, I've learned over the years being remote from a different time zone to just figure out things by myself. Never, like, whenever I need to synchronize with someone else, for me, it's a bit stop in my productivity. So I just try to organize myself so I don't need it, or I try to do things differently. But yeah, some people on my team are more involved. But it can be some things like a product team is trying to do something and Rails doesn't work so well for what they're doing. So either it's too slow or not flexible enough. And there's a bit of discussion with them on trying to figure out what they're trying to do and come up with an improvement. Sometimes it's going to be just some private library. Sometimes it's going to be an upstream contribution. We have the chance that we're mostly running on Rails Edge. So if we come up with some Rails shortcoming and we fix it in Rails, we directly merge it, we upgrade it in our app, and they can use it immediately. So we don't have the whole thing of like, oh, we built something for you, but you're going to get it next year when you upgrade, So that adds a lot of flexibility with that.
I'm curious, when it comes to like keeping like Ruby gems compatible, are you often just working on the gems themselves and sending contributions, or what does that kind of look like?
Yeah. That's something historically I did a lot. I've set up OCI to nightly. I mean, it's still called nightly. In reality, it runs every hour. We're testing our giant monolith against Rubyhead, like the last, basically like the trunk of Ruby. So we're often catching regression, either in gems, like some gems doing things that were working but were not specified. So we fix the gem. Or sometimes it's Ruby that made a change that it shouldn't have, so we fix Ruby. So yeah, that's a big focus I have. I mean, it doesn't take that much time, honestly. Like it's stable enough. But yeah, that's so I racked up like contribution in like several hundred gems. There's often a joke from colleagues or friends that whenever they go look at the GitHub of whatever gems they're using, I'm the last committer on it.
You show up a lot?
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like kind of a bit of a dream setup for a lot of teams. Like, do you think, like, I'm sure that then ends up helping like the rest of us in the community. Do you feel like that's something that you're seeing more of the community be able to handle that type of stuff? Or do you feel like there's more of a Ruby ecosystem thing that should be addressed? Or do you feel like Shopify is able to fulfill that? Or
yeah, it's a hard question because on one end, it's the type of work that only really makes sense once you reach a certain size. Like it makes no sense to have like a Ruby infrastructure team when you have like 10 developers.
Yeah.
You cannot commit. Whereas when you have like 1,000 developers, it makes sense to commit like 10 people, and then it's a drop in the ocean in terms of your resources, but it has a very important impact. Like whenever we shave 1% performance or like productivity for developers, that basically pay for salary, right? So there's a few other companies that are contributing a bit upstream, but it's not as they don't have as much commitment as Shopify has. Simply, also because they don't maybe not have the size
Yeah.
required to be able to do as much commitment. But I sure wish there would be more company, because I mean, we do a lot of work, but we have a blind side, right? Just to give you an example, Shopify doesn't use the view layer of Rails, like doesn't use Action View anymore. There was years ago, there was a migration to GraphQL and React and all these things. So me personally, I have zero, I mean, except on those like small dev tools or whatever, but I don't have the experience of running all this stack at scale and be able to do improvements on Rails for that. So if there was other company using these things at a larger scale and seeing more problem with it, that would be valuable. So yeah, we do a lot, but we have our blind spots. So there's definitely place for other company to come up and be more, I cannot find the word, but like be more ambitious with it.
No, I think that's interesting. And thinking about how it's great that Shopify is able to get to the situation where they can stay essentially on, Rails edge, and because they're relying on all these other gems that you're able to kind of keep an eye on and make sure that Ruby's going to be it's going to be compatible with the new version of Ruby, the new version of Rails, and any of the other dependencies that you might have there. And a lot of smaller teams don't have necessarily that capacity to do that. And so they're kind of like, well, we have to kind of wait until the community sorts this stuff out, or maybe one of us will do that. And maybe they don't feel like they're confident enough to even start, open up a gem and start figuring that out in the first place. So
yeah, but that's something I try to publicize in like either my blogging or my talks or whatever, is that I think in one of my talks I had like some saying, which is like your gems, like your dependencies are your code too. Like when you do gem install something, you're using the code of someone you don't immediately have access to, but like you're still running this code in production on your machine. And if it doesn't work, it's your responsibility. Like you. So it's not very different from code that has been written by a colleague of yours who maybe is in vacation, and you're not just going to say like, oh no, it's like Robby's code, I'm just going to wait 2 weeks for him to come back, right? You just jump on it because that's your code. Well, that's the idea of open source. You hit the code and like, yes, of course, maybe the maintainer is not going to manage your change immediately, maybe he's occupied or whatever, but like with Bundler, you can just fork the repo, make a PR, you can directly point your Gemfile at the PR and have your fix ready. And then like the actual merging and publishing can just happen later on. It's just fine. So I really encourage like everyone listening, like whenever you have a problem with a gem, whatever it is, like if it's Rails or anything, just like bundle open the name of the gem, it's going to open your editor.
Yeah.
Like, you can see all the code and you're going to see it's not that, I mean, there's a few very airy gems out there, but like most of them are not that complicated. If you're able to write a Rails application, you should be able to figure out what's wrong in that gem. You just put statement everywhere and you figure it out.
No, it's I wanted to dig into this particular scenario because I work in consulting, and so I come into scenarios where clients have their team, and then they're like, "Well, we've been stuck on this gem for a while, and we're waiting on the the maintainers to get back to us on this issue. We're not sure if we could figure it out ourselves." And then sometimes I'll do some pairing, or someone on our team will do pairing, and we'll find out that like they've just never really ever opened up a gem before. And I'm like, well, you could just let's just change it, even if we're not trying to fix something. Let's just poke around at it. So
no, but I get it. It's a bit intimidating at first, but I really want to encourage people to try it because that's how you grow the most. Like with seeing other people code and also like gem code to be quite different from applicative one, because you really need to have a different mindset when you're coding. You cannot take shortcuts. You really need to write your APIs in a way that doesn't make too many assumptions about how it's used and things like that. So it's a very good skill to develop. But then again, like it can happen that sometimes like something is really blocked and I won't fault one for not trying, but it's just I really want to encourage. It's not that hard.
How do you think about when teams are evaluating potential gems to use in their projects? What sort of signals or indicators, as someone that knows that you feel comfortable enough to make changes to projects like that? A lot of people like might be looking around like, hey, we need to find something that integrates with this API, and there's 5 gems that supposedly do it. What sort of things would you look for in that process to be like, well, which gem might we pick? Is it the one with the most stars? Is it the one with the most recent commits? Or do you think those are maybe bad signals?
Yeah, it varies a lot. Like I think the reality is most people, including at Shopify, like don't really deeply review the gems they're including. Often because there's just one. Very, very frequently, you're trying to integrate with an API and there's just one gem, so you don't even ask question. And there might be a cursory glance at it, but since I often get involved when there's problem, I can tell you I've seen a lot of things. But I wish would have been seen before adding the gem. But so, I mean, stars and all, I think is very low signal. I think it's more open issues, but not just the number of open issues. It's not a good indication. It's more like look at the last 10 open issues and see if there was any activity on it. Like not even like 10 opens, like the last 10 issues, including close one. Just see if there's like, if they're being addressed is really the thing. Because there's some software out there that hasn't been updated. Like there's some gem that haven't been updated in 10 years and they work just perfectly fine. And there's no issue open on the repo or just like a few very weird edge cases. And the software is mostly final and it just needs maybe an updating every 5 years whenever something breaks, compatibility or whatever. So it's more that, like for me, it's more like the open issues is whether they're being addressed. Meaning like I'm a maintainer myself, so it's totally fine for a maintainer to just not want to deal with something anymore. But then as a user, you need to see if the project is healthy. And for me, it's like whether issues are handled.
Do you take a step as far as maybe downloading the gem and testing it out yourself a little bit from like just grabbing that gem and see if you can run the tested?
I just review the code.
Okay.
Then I look for, I've been doing this for 15 years, so a bit more.
It's intuitive maybe, or
17. I cannot really tell you exactly the criteria, but I look at the code and say like, okay, this is someone who knows what they're doing. Whereas sometimes there's some like smells I see and I'm like, I don't feel confident with this gem. Like I remember, like I have actually it's open source, like one tool I'm somewhat maintaining at Shopify, which is Ship It engine. And so it's just a plain simple Rails app and it has an API. And so it's used it's been done a long time ago. So it uses active model serializers. And at some point, like I'm not actively trying to replace it, but at some point I wanted to replace it. And someone suggested a gem that looked cool. And then I just opened it and I realized like, oh, it's lots of C code. Like to be very, very fast, they use lots of C code. And I was like, I'm not confident running C code for that because I've seen so much C code segfault in production. I'm like, yeah, it's fast, but it's not worth it. I'm just going to stick to the old thing. So at the end of the day, it's a good feeling. And it's fine. Like if you commit to a gem, as I said, like it's open source, you can fix it. It's just sometimes if you realize after 10 years, you're going to be painted into a corner because you're going to have so much code that depend on it. But at the end of the day, it's just malleable. You can fix the problem you're having.
Do you look at things like their own dependencies to see what else might be coming along for the right or?
Yeah, I mean, like a very large, it always depends what you're doing, like sometimes there's this debate whether like you should vendor things or if a little dependency is better than like vendor code, but you won't be able to update as easily. So it really depends what it's doing, but it's sure I appreciate less dependencies because, and not just less dependencies, also the way the version is specified. Like something I absolutely hate is gems that put like an upper limit on some things. So for example, like some thing that integrate with Rails. And so they tested Rails 8 and they say like, I'm compatible with Rails 7 to inferior to 9 because they don't know what Rails 9 is going to look like, right? But the problem is like 1 or 2 years from now, we're going to release Rails 9 and we won't be able to upgrade because we gem put a lock on it. So we're going to need to do a PR as to bump or remove that upper. So this is an anti-pattern to me. I get why people do it, but in practice, it's better to assume that it's going to continue to work, even on a major.
For those listening, could you offer an experiment of something they could go do today? Like, hey, I've never opened up a gem before. I've never really gone down that path. Like, you mentioned using bundle open and stuff. Like, maybe give them like a little bit of an experiment they can go do in 15 minutes today.
Yeah, pick a gem in your Gemfile. You're curious how it works, and just bundle open that gem, the name of a gem. Is going to open your editor. If it doesn't work, it's probably because you don't have your editor environment variable set correctly. And just, go look at it, put print statement in the middle. It's fine. We all put debuggers and try to, like any gems you have and you're like, oh, I wonder how they do this, just go and solve for yourself.
This episode of On Rails is brought to you by Redirect To, the fastest, easiest way to get your users where they actually belong. Someone signs up, logs in, submits a form you're hoping doesn't crash. Don't just sit there rendering views, let Redirect To take the wheel. Trusted by 99% of Rails developers who've ever whispered, this action shouldn't have a view anyways. Fast, reliable, built right into Rails. Redirect To, proudly keeping users out of your create action since 2005. You had a post recently, or not too long ago, about Shopify's move to Pitchfork. From the outside, the name doesn't give much away, so I'd love to hear how you would explain it. What is Pitchfork, and why did Shopify decide to build it?
Well, Shopify didn't decide. I did that a bit on my own. But yes, it's a fork of a previous server that people may have heard about called Unicorn, which is somewhat venerable. I mean, it's been around since 2009 or 10 or something like that.
Yeah.
Has mostly been replaced by Puma in the community, but a bunch of large companies like Shopify, at least for the bigger apps, stick to it. GitHub was also running Unicorn. Zendesk is also running Unicorn. Usually, like those big monoliths were running that. Some may think it's because why wouldn't you use Puma, right? Puma is threaded, so you're going to get more efficiency, more throughput, or whatever. Some may think it's because we're not thread safe, which might be true, but if we wanted to be thread safe, we could. We have the means to do it. It's mostly that all applications are not very I/O intensive. Like on, let's say, like a random number, 100 millisecond request, we're going to spend like 60, 70 milliseconds actually crunching Ruby. And maybe 30 milliseconds doing IOs. And as some people may have heard, Ruby has something called the GVL, or maybe they heard about Python's chill, which is exactly the same thing. In Ruby, you can use threads, and you can parallelize IOs with threads. So if you have, you need to do 10 HTTP requests, you can start 10 threads, and each of your threads does one HTTP request. All of that's going to happen in parallel, at least the IO part, like the writing into a socket, reading from the socket, all that's going to be parallelized. But then if those HTTP requests return you some JSON to you, and you need to pass that JSON, this is CPU work, and that won't be parallelizable, because to do that, you need to hold that famous global VM lock, which is a lock. And so all your 10 threads will have to acquire that lock, pass that JSON, release the lock so that the next thread can do it over. So in our case, if I go back to that 60 milliseconds spent on executing Ruby on a 100 milliseconds request, if you use Puma with, say, 2 threads, and you try to do 2 of those requests in parallel, at some point, you're going to have one request that's going to want to crunch some CPU for some reason. I don't know, render a template or whatever. And it's going to try to acquire the GVL to do so, and it won't be able to because another request also needs it. So the consequence of that is your request that you should have responded in 100 milliseconds, now you're going to respond in 110 milliseconds. You're suddenly 10% slower, so your latency has degraded. On the other hand, you improve your throughput, so the number of requests you can handle in, like, say, 1 minute or 1 hour augmented, because when previously your process was idle for 30 milliseconds or 40 milliseconds doing its IOs, you've crunched some more CPU. Now, threads is one way to reclaim this lost time, but another way, which is what you usually do when you're with Unicorn, is you say, okay, we're spending 30% of our time doing IOs. So instead of having one process per core, like let's say we're on a 16-core server, we're going to spawn 1.5 process per core. So 16 plus 5, 24.
Okay.
And so we're going to let the Linux kernel, or like the operating system, notice that all Ruby process is doing IOs and is not using the CPU anymore. And the operating system studio is going to say, okay, that process I put on the side, and I let another one execute. And so you're going to have a better, like your 16 CPU is going to be better shared between those 24 processes than they would have been if you had like 16 processes, each with its dedicated CPU, and 2 threads in. So that's really the idea. Now, the downside of doing this is that since you're having more processes, you're going to use more memory, because when two threads run in a process, they share most of their memory. The only memory they don't share is their stack.
Mm-hmm.
For those who did a bit of like system programming, heap and the stack, they share the entire heap. They have their own stack, but the stack is nothing. Like it's a few megabytes, whereas the heap can be like hundreds,
Okay.
if not gigabytes on very large applications. So when let's say you have like a 1 gigabyte, if you have two threads into a 1 gigabit process, it's 1 gigabyte. If you spawn a second process, in theory, you're using 2 gigabytes instead of 1, because they don't share anything. But actually, that's not true, because since like 40 or 50 years, what we use to create a second process is a fork system call. And so what it does is it creates semantically, it creates a copy of your process,
Mm-hmm.
but in practice, it doesn't do a real copy. It does what's called copy on write, which means that instead of copying all the pages of memory, what it does is that it creates some sort of pointer, like reference to the original memory. And then whenever one of the two processes writes, modify this memory, it just stops it, makes a copy for real this time, and then resume. And so assuming that most of your heap is read-only, which is kind of the case, then fork is not actually like using two processes instead of one is not actually doubling your memory. It's increasing it by like maybe 30%, maybe 50%. It depends how well you're able to not modify that memory. And Ruby is actually pretty good. Like in Python really, really want to get rid of the GIL, because Python uses reference counting, which means every time you access an object, you're actually modifying it because there's a counter in the object. So if you're trying to use multiprocessing with Python, you're invalidating memory like crazy, very, very fast. Whereas Ruby has a much more advanced GC, and it doesn't touch objects that are read-only. So you can actually, like from my experiments in production with Unicorn, we had anywhere between like 40 and 60% of the memory being shared between the processes. So if we go back at all, like 24 processes, and if it's 1 gigabyte, well, if you have like 50% of that's shared between all the process, that's going to be like 500 megabytes that are shared by all of them, and then 24 times 5 other 100 megabytes. So you're at like 12 and a half gigabytes for 24 process. So that's way less than what you would have expected right from the start. So yeah, that's copy on write and GVL all at once.
Interesting. There's a lot of things I want to kind of unpack there for the audience, and in particular, go back to Pitchfork and Unicorn, and I think I was just looking at the stats just for, looks like the survey we ran last year, it's like about 9% of the community said that they were using Unicorn, give or take that, but it also sounds like some of the largest apps might be leaning on Unicorn or a variant of it.
Yep.
What is it about Shopify's environment that you think is Puma's faster? In theory, I'm like air quoting, but
faster is not exactly the word.
But that's the common perception, is that like Puma outpaced Unicorn. This is why you should upgrade. And I think the community has said, okay, great, we're all going to come along for the ride. So that's not accurate.
It's not. Yeah, I want to answer to your point faster, because I think that's something that a lot of people get wrong in a lot of performance discussion. I really want to insist on latency versus throughput. Latency is like how fast, like if you go on, I don't know, you need to buy tickets and there's like a thing and you go in the line. Latency is like how fast you get your ticket, you, one person. Throughput is how many tickets that shop can sell in an hour. It's not necessarily intuitive, but if we take a car example, like with a Ferrari, you can ship someone 100 kilometers away in 30 minutes. But if you have like 200 people to move there, like your Ferrari going back and forth is not going to cut it. With a bus or with even people on bikes, they're going to get there faster if you have 100 people. So it's important to understand that faster can mean a lot of things in different contexts.
Interesting, yeah.
So I would argue that if you don't care about how much money you're using, how much memory you're using, Unicorn or Pitchfork is going to be faster than Puma, because you're going to have less contention of things, because it's going to answer faster. But that doesn't mean it's going to be able to handle more customers at the same time. So it's really extremely important to understand that. Otherwise, it's impossible to have like proper discussion about performance.
That's really helpful. I think a lot of the performance metrics that people will post tend to seem like they're more focused on throughput. And I think everybody's worried about this imaginary or maybe real life scenario where they're going to have all this traffic hitting their website, or their web app at the same time. And like, we need to be able to stay up and keep things up and running and everything. And that's not always maybe the particular metric you should be thinking about. And this, so it's like a IO bound and like CPU bound. Can you tell us, is that kind of coming to that or?
Yes. Yeah, I guess that answers your previous question, which is like, why did the community, like why Puma? Why Puma was made? Puma was built on the assumption that most Rails application, or at least web applications, spend a lot of time on iOS. If you look at the default setting of Puma, is that it runs with 5 threads. And that's actually relatively recent. I think it's Nate Berkopek who advocated for reducing it to 5. Historically, it has been like something like 30. And the assumption is like, okay, all apps are mostly just talking to the database. Like it's just a small proxy to the database, or even like at some period of time, it was very popular to call on like third-party APIs or things like that. So we're doing all these IOs, or process is mostly idle. So we can just, even if Ruby has a GVL, we can just spawn threads and we're gonna like use all these things, right? It's also important to note that Puma was started by a person who was working on Ruby News, which was an implementation of Ruby with didn't have a GVL. So I think there was also some long-term view of like, eventually in the future, the GVL will be gone and we should open thread. Now, whether Rails apps are truly IO bonds or not, it's anyone's guess. I have a blog post where I explain why I think for the vast majority of apps, it's not true, which mostly bring around like YJIT. Like if recently you enabled YJIT and you've seen like 20-25% improvement, YJIT not going to speed up your iOS. It's only going to speed up your Ruby code. And your Ruby code is not, you're not only holding the GVL when running Ruby code, you're also holding the GVL when calling into like C functions, and there's plenty of them in Ruby. So if YJIT is able to speed up your app that much, it means you're not doing that much iOS. No, there are IO heavy apps out there. Like they exist. I've discussed with a few people who have them. Like they actually are proxies. Like some, I don't remember what it is. I think it's a weather API. Like there's an app, a Rails app out there that just when you hit it with a request, it directly call onto another web service and just do a bit of transformation, send it back to you. This is a very good use case for Puma. It could even be a very good use case for Falcon, which is lean even more on the trade-off and is even better for very IO-bound apps. But if you're doing your classic Rails app where you don't have too many slow queries into your database or anything, you'll find, if you instrument it, you'll find that you're probably not spending significantly more than 50% of your time on iOS. And if you think about it, if only one thread can execute code at a time, and you have like 5 threads, which is a Puma default, it means a request is only allowed to use the CPU 20% of the time. So it assumes that your app is doing 80% iOS at least. And that's in the best case scenario, because your request may not want to execute perfectly after the other. Sometimes even if they only want to execute 20% of the time, that might be at the same time that another 20% of time want to do it, and you're going to have contention and you're going to have to wait. So actually to use 5 threads without contention, you probably need something like more like 85-90% iOS, which is really hard to come by. Like if you're doing that much iOS, either you're just a proxy, or you have like serious problem with your queries to the database.
Interesting. Let's say someone listening suspects that they're, say, IO bound. What could they do to test that theory?
Yeah, that's the problem. Is that's also something I explain in my blog post. Is that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you think you're IO bound, what you're gonna do is you're gonna crank up more threads, right? Because that's the thing. And the problem is, like the classic thing to measure how much IO you're doing is like before you do an IO, you take the time, and after you're done doing the IO, you subtract the current time, and you're like, oh, okay, I did IOs for 10 milliseconds. But did you actually do IOs for 10 milliseconds? Because for Ruby to be able to compute how much time, like to do your subtraction, it needs to reacquire the GVL. So if it was waiting on another thread for 50 milliseconds, it's going to tell you're going to think you did 50 milliseconds IO, but actually you were already CPU exhausted. So it's tricky. There's not great ways. A couple Ruby versions ago, I think it was in 3.1 or 3.2, I added an API to instrument the GVL, but you can only do it in C. And I have there's a few gems out there. I have one which is like Shopify/GVL tools, where you have a way to see for a given amount of time, like it's a monolithic timer. Whenever a thread is waiting to acquire the GVL, it's just going to increment the timer. So you can just, before your request, after your request, look at it. And then you're going to be able to see if you were slowed down in any way. Now, the second problem is people usually will just configure their Puma and they say like, okay, 5 thread or whatever. But you don't know if it's too many until they're all being used. Because you might configure 5 thread, but on average, there's only 1 or 2 being used. And suddenly you have a spike of traffic and like the 5 of them are being used. And now you're way more overloaded because your application bit more than it could chew. And then like everything becomes slower, right? So it's extremely hard because you will need to simulate traffic or ensure that like the real question to ask yourself is not, oh, the app is milling along when there's the baseline on traffic. It's like, when all my servers are fully busy, am I degrading my latency? Like, are all my requests getting slower when suddenly I'm using all the capacity I declared I had? And that's harder to do because you need to simulate traffic and you need to simulate it in a realistic way because you might have an endpoint that's an API endpoint that does a lot of rendering and is more CPU heavy, and one that's doing a slow query, so it's more IO heavy. So when you're going to have your sudden spike of traffic, which one going to be the more impacted? So it's a very hard question. Unfortunately, I don't really have a great answer to that. I think the best solution is really to have instrumentation in place so that you can have like dashboard. And when suddenly, like you don't know, like one night, suddenly your response times were through the roof, you're able to pinpoint saying like, oh yeah, we got a spike of traffic. We could see the GVL contention going up, which means we over-configured our Puma. And it would have been better for requests to queue at the entrance rather than run havoc in the living room when nobody could save them, right? It's kind of like I'm trying to make a metaphor, but...
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I was looking at the GVL tools gem yesterday, and because I noticed that doing a little bit of preparation for the conversation, and I saw that AppSignal had a little bit of detail on that. And if you just install the gem, or you just add it to your Gemfile and deploy it, it'll automatically start adding some instrumentation, I guess, to their dashboard.
Yes.
I haven't actually got a chance to play with that yet, but I was kind of curious, like, what would people see there? What kind of information would it?
Right. So I haven't looked in details. I heard about the AppSignal thing, and I'm really, really happy they did it because when I created this API and then the gem, it was really in the intent that I had no intent to integrate any of that in Rails or whatever. My intent was that companies like AppSignal, Neuralink, whoever, I don't know if I need to quote 3 brands or something to...
Yeah.
Datadog. Okay, that's 3.
Datadog, Sentry, Honey Badger, yada.
Perfect. That's 3 of them. So I'm not... but that's exactly what I hoped for. I really hope that like it's their turf. They're the one who know to present that data to their customer for them to make things. So I think it's great. What I'm hoping they would show is, like this kind of this graph where you see your response time decomposed in like that many milliseconds on the database, that many seconds executing Ruby. And I would like for them to remove from the Ruby part the time spent waiting for the GVL so that people could say, it's the same thing. Also in those graphs, usually you have like a request queuing. So that's really what you want to see. If people are familiar with request queuing, if they talk about it, well, GVL queuing is exactly the same thing. We say contention because it's a lock, but literally it's a queue. Like the thread, like in the Ruby VM, the threads are in a queue waiting to get the GVL. It's exactly the same thing.
I'm curious about, thinking about performance in general, how often are you working with your teams there if they're trying to work out some performance things? Does Shopify have very clear distinction of when they might move some code outside of like, say, a web or API endpoint request? And like, this needs to be more of a background job, or we're going to offload this because it's maybe a little bit more CPU heavy type of thing, or?
Yeah, so I don't have great insight on that because really when I get involved with that, it's like a less common performance issue or it's very tied to Rails. But from back in the day and from I still design my Rails app is really like anything that can be put in a job should probably be put in a job, especially like one big rule is never call onto like a third-party service from your controller or like from like the request cycle. Like the app I mentioned before, Ship It Engine, you'd think it's impossible to do it without ever doing an API call from a request because it's an app that's synchronized with GitHub. Like it literally scan your repo to know and tell you to do deployment. So it tell you like, oh, you have like 5 undeployed commits or whatever. But it's entirely built about the idea that no API calls are allowed in the request cycle. Everything is done from background jobs. So to me, reason number one to do a job is you're calling onto something that's other than your cache or your database. Anything that you don't control, anything that could be slow, that could fail and need to be retried, you want it to be in a background job.
Interesting. Well, in that particular scenario, then, are those jobs pre-fetching information then, say from like GitHub in that scenario?
Yes.
So before the web request even happens, it's already fetched it?
Yeah.
And is that
It's literally constantly mirroring some GitHub state in the database so that it can be efficiently displayed and redundant. And it causes all the classic problem of reconciliation, all these things. But the idea was for the app to be snappy. And because previously we had like an old Node.js app that was doing API calls on the fly and would sometimes be very slow to answer. And I really designed it all about like whatever data we need to be displayed need to be in the database. And so if we need it to the database, we just constantly sync. We receive webhooks. We know something changed.
Okay. I was curious if you're getting webhooks that kind of triggers. There's some sort of action happening that's telling it to do that. So before say an end user sees a web interface that's already been fetched. So, and I think there's always that balance that when we're working on projects or working with clients, they're trying to have real-time, air quoting, real-time data to some degree. And like, when do you pre-cache things? And are you doing a lot of pre-caching and maybe no one's actually like, are you doing like a bunch of work over the weekend and no one's going to log in and look at the dashboard over the weekend, So how do you like balance, like we have a lot of CPU processing happening. We need to have this stuff constantly running stuff that no one's seeing until the next time when they show up to work on Monday. And like,
the thing I learned about optimization is that it's extremely contextual. Like I do optimization, like most of my work is doing optimization of like like JSON, passing a JSON document is slow, make it faster. Like there's no question asked.
Yeah.
When you're trying to optimize a business application, like something that does something and you have customers and you know them, you can observe them, you can learn about them, is this sort of trick. I remember it was not even in Ruby, but I remember back in the day, like some app that was always updating, like there was some polling or whatever. And at some point I just cut like the server usage in more than half by simply, I think there was a browser API that was introduced to know if the tab was active. And it's just like, if the tab is inactive, just poll every 30 seconds instead of like 5 seconds. But that's the sort of thing, like to your question, like if nobody's looking at the data, then just maybe you could even record like the pattern of people looking at it and to know this customer is looking at it a lot, so we're going to prefetch it. This customer never look at it, so we're just going to do it on the fly. That's the sort of optimization you can do on an application level, can hardly do on like framework library level, which I usually work more. But yes, it's really like optimization is about knowing what you need to do and do nothing more than what you need to do.
Yeah.
And also know what you can spare not doing.
Yeah, it's true. Or you can optimize things by like, maybe the cron job or whatever is running it is like less often on non-work days, it could be like we don't need as many servers running this thing all the time. Like for a long time within the Rails ecosystem, there are a lot of naysayers are like Rails and Ruby are slow. And so we'll just throw more hardware at it. And, now Shopify is one of the, largest, it's a pretty big platform, right? And so like, do you still think it's like a hardware thing, or do you feel like there's a lot of trying to like, how do we just optimize the hardware that we're on or the machines that we're like, how much do you still advocate to people like just bring up some more servers or spin up more CPUs or throw more memory at it or dig it down into the Rails code itself or your own application code to see if you can optimize it more first?
My answer is going to be a bit boring, but it's really use the right tool for the right job. As in like, I don't think like, I don't care to say it's fast or slow because it's a spectrum, right? You have slower than Ruby, you have faster than Ruby. And what is fast anyway? Like faster execution, yes. Faster development cycles, depends.
Yeah.
You have to, like, those relatively slow, whatever, it's really bricks of like not very experienced people or whatever, because ultimately when you look at a company finance sheet, like the server cost might be way less than the developer salaries. Like, what if you migrate to Rails and suddenly you need twice as many servers, but your developers make twice as many features? Maybe that's what you need right now. Or maybe you're 10 years later and you don't need so many new features and stuff, and you need to cut your costs down. Like, it really depends what your business model is. Like the very famous Rails exit is Twitter. But if you look at Twitter back in those days, they were not making any money. They didn't even have ads. They were scaling traffic like crazies. Apps, and they had like a relatively small feature set, but didn't evolve that much since then. I mean, it makes total sense to try to optimize as much as you can. And I love Ruby. I would have, in their situation, I would have done the same. If you look at Shopify instead, well, we have like customers paying a sizable subscription to be on the platform. People who actually use the platform end up paying with their credit card at the end, and we take a cut on that. So, I mean, yes, if we could make Ruby 10 times faster overnight like that, that would be wonderful for Shopify, but that's not the only metric. And at the end of the day, the question you need to ask yourself, but that's more like a CTO kind of thing, is like, how many does it cost me to serve one request or a million requests or whatever? And how much money does serving those 1 million requests bring me? As long as you're positive or you have a lot of funding to burn through, it's fine. That's really like an economic kind of decision. It's not like being fast to be fast. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you want to serve your response in a decent amount of time, but you're going to have customers who are like, we're going to be like 100 milliseconds away. So if you serve in like 12 milliseconds instead of 20, are they going to see it? I don't know. You just need to be fast enough. That's the real thing.
I'm curious about, you mentioned that Shopify relies on or has made a switch at some point to GraphQL and React on the front end. And I'm curious about, did that generate new types of performance issues with having that separation there in terms of like the volume of web requests that are like, maybe rather than maybe what a typical Rails app might have, like the full cycle goes through the whole process and you get a web view displayed in the browser. Maybe you start adding some JavaScript stuff that's pulling some other stuff as well, and you have these extra requests. In that scenario, did it like exponentially increase the number of traffic Rails needed to process, or?
Honestly, I don't have the data, but I don't think so. Like, the GraphQL API is used a ton, but I don't think it's so much by people browsing the admin. I think it's mostly bots, like not bots necessarily as we think of it, but like API integration, like third-party tools and things like that. I haven't dug too much into it. I know that GraphQL is like it's very pleasant to use as a consumer. It's very painful to implement as a server, because basically you give so much flexibility that customers always come up with a new weird data access pattern that's hard to optimize. But overall, no, I don't have a very strong opinion on it. Like me, if I do an app for myself, I'm just not going to bother with that. I'm just going to do good old like HTML back in the day.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm too conservative. I don't know. But two is a bit of an economic decision at the end of the day. It's that like for better or for worse, React became an industry standard. So it's easy to hire for. There's pattern emerging with all these things. I think it's beyond the merits of the technology itself. There's an advantage of going with the flow,
Yeah. I can appreciate that. I think I don't know when this episode will come out, but I feel like earlier today I saw Duncan from Shopify post something about GraphQL and being a little bit more complicated to debug or track because is it because they're all using the same endpoint, or do you have an idea what that?
Yeah, that would be my one gripe with GraphQL, is that everything is on the same endpoint and is a post. So even if it's read only, you don't have like the old REST thing where oh, it's a get, so I can just retry it, right? It's fine. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it was just a minor design thing. But yes, at the end of the day, everything, I mean, you can have multiple GraphQL endpoints, like you can have your admin GraphQL API and your whatever, but yeah, you have like blobs of queries arriving at the same endpoint, and you need to figure out how to deal with them. There's a few gem in Ruby, but they're okay, I guess. But
I'm curious about you had a post about instrumenting thread stalls in a Rails app. So for folks who aren't familiar, what is a thread stall?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned before. So that's when a thread just finished doing some IO. So let's say you do like select something from your database. So what Ruby is going to do is you release the GVL, do the IO, wait for the network packet to come back, and then try to reacquire the GVL. And the stall is going to be like, oh, I cannot get the GVL right now because I know the thread is busy doing something. So yeah, stall as in like the thread cannot get moving because
I see
something prevents it.
Yeah. And if you're kind of like going through that process, like putting sensors on a race car, and not just to track how fast it goes, but to see where it's overheating.
Yeah, I guess. I think the metaphor usually used is like, I don't know, you have like 5 kids in a kindergarten, and like they have one pair of scissors and they need to be nice and give them, maybe you shouldn't give scissors to kindergarten, but
maybe, I don't know. I was trying to use a race car reference just for David there. Yeah. But, and Toby, I guess too. But I tried. I know you've also been a little transitional. Talk about your time on the Rails core team, because you've been there for a number of years now. So what kind of contributions or ideas kind of led to the invitation, like to even be part of the Rails core team?
I think my big feature that owed me the invitation was active record async queries, which are slowly picking up in the community a bit. For those who don't know, the idea is that like if you have a slow query that you really cannot optimize for whatever reason, you can schedule it to be run on a background thread, and you get like a feature like you would get in JavaScript or other. So it's useful in specific context, but it's not more complicated than that. If you have a well-optimized database, like many queries are a fraction of a millisecond and are not really worth going through the whole like async thing. But yeah, that was my breakthrough. But I think more generally was just due to me upgrading Rails in Shopify's monolith regularly. I just was on top of lots of bugs and things like that. So I think I was just coming up on the top contributors, slowly grinding up the list.
And, having been on the Rails core team for a while now, how has that changed how you think about Rails, especially in terms of when to build something yourself versus, say, upstream it?
I don't think it had changed my view of Rails much more, but it made me feel more empowered to steer its direction, which is the whole point of being on the core team, honestly. But yeah,
do you feel that way? It is to help steer rather than just maintain?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do way more maintaining than steering.
Okay.
But I feel empowered to my opinions much more than I was before. Because at the end of the day, like the idea of the core team is like you get on the core team not because you have a million contribution or whatever. It's because you like the criteria, like the informal criteria is you have demonstrated that you're trusted to develop a new feature or something that's going to be in line with the general design. Like basically it's a stamp to say like, okay, you got Rails, you understood how it's supposed to work. Now, of course, that's the general idea. Like we sometimes disagree and all that.
Yeah.
But it means that like 90% of what you're going to do, everybody's going to say, oh yeah, good idea. Nice. Like I did a year or two back, I did like the whole Rails.error reporting API.
Yeah.
So it's like a generic interface for all those Sentry and other error reporting tools to integrate themselves. I wanted to do it because sometimes in Rails, we rescue errors for you. Because, like if you're reading to your cache and your Redis instance is unavailable or something, like, should we break your application or we should treat it as like a miss? So we decided to say like, oh, if Redis is not responding, we just pretend the key wasn't there and we just go on. It's the whole point of a cache, right? But the problem is like, we would really like to notify you that, hey, your Redis instance is not doing well and you should take action.
Yeah.
So we needed a way to report errors to users without just raising and breaking the app. So that's why I developed that.
Yeah.
And so far, like, at least the one we mentioned it in core, we're pretty happy, and probably would have done something very, very similar. So that's the whole idea of being in core, is that it's like a club of people who have similar taste in API design.
Yeah. Is there anything about Rails that you wish more developers understood, or?
So it's not something specific, but there's something that really get me started really, really quick is whenever someone mentioned the word magic with Rails.
Yes.
And I know Eileen did it in a talk, but it's fine. We're in the same API design club of Rails core, so it's fine. I know Eileen very well. She's a coworker. She's great. But more in general, like when people complain, oh, it's too magic, I don't understand how it works. Well, really, like, just that's what I said before with bundle open. It's just like, open the thing, go look at it. There's a few very airy parts in Rails. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like things like callbacks are like the dragon's den, really. I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole because some of they work. I don't understand how they work, but they do. So I'm not gonna break it. But most of Rails is really not that hard to understand. It might seem magic because many APIs are using a bit of a DSL to make it look nice. I'm not always fond of it, but it just to appeal to the eye. But it's a very thin layer. Once you just pry open that method, you look at it, it's not that complicated.
Yeah. I'm curious about the callback. Are you saying that the Dragon's Den is like as far as like understanding the underlying code, or is it that like, or using callbacks in general?
Yeah, no. I mean, like, there's a whole debate of whether you should use callback or not. But the underlying code that like generate like the call tree is like, oh my god, I had so many headaches with it.
Who on the team tends to be the go-to people for? Is there very distinct areas of the Rails core code base that's like, all right, these two people are kind of like own that area, or is that kind of shift?
There's no exact turf, but clearly people have different familiarities with different parts. Like when we're talking, if I have to do something with active record connection management, like Eileen did a big refactor a couple of years ago, so I'm certainly going to mention to her. Matthew Draper is also often working in that area, so he's like my go-to person to bounce ideas. There's other people like that. Anything involving front end, you gotta talk to David. No way around it, because he has very, very strong opinion about everything front end. So yeah, you just learn, but it's not like, oh, this is my turf, you cannot touch it. But it's like a courtesy thing of like, hey, you recently did something there, so maybe you have opinions. Because even though like being in core, you're trusted to do the thing, but at least me, I often need kind of someone to bounce the idea off. Like it's a bit like like a rubber duck. Sometimes I just need confirmation that I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
So, but it's a lot of one-on-one conversations. It's not necessarily a very formal thing.
When you first started getting in or deciding that you were going to interact and say, I'm assuming it was like the time of GitHub, maybe when you first started working on Rails, I'm assuming were you around pre-GitHub when it was on?
I was around pre-GitHub, yeah.
And Subversion?
Yeah. Pre-bundler as well. I think I started on 1.2, something like that, like 2007, 2008.
Okay. I think my first was 0.12.
Oh, wow.
But I remember one of my first contributions was with Jeremy Kemper helped me work on adding some stuff to so he was able to interact with me because I found like a bug because I use Postgres and
it wasn't popular at the time.
No, it was not very popular at the time. And so I was like, well, there's this weird thing happening. And then Jeremy was able to help me get some of my first PRs, or we didn't call them pull requests back then. I guess it was just like diffs merged or whatever we used to say back then. But I was curious, like when you how did you decide I'm going to start? Do you remember anymore? Has it been such a long time? Like, what was that like to be a developer? Like, maybe I could participate a little bit.
Actually, my contribution came relatively late. I think it was mentioned on my welcome post in the core team. I had as I said, I started dabbling in Rails in 2007, and I think by 2011 I had like a typo fix in some documentation, and that's only my real sizable contribution to Rails. Actually, I made a talk out of it was when I joined Shopify in 2013.
Okay.
It was like a crazy race condition in active record counter caches. That was a crazy one, and that was my first one, and since then I continued. But it just I have a somewhat perhaps contrarian view about open source. It's like I'm often asked like, oh, I would like to contribute to Rails or something else. Like, I do get to it, and I'm like, honestly, like, don't. To me, I don't remember if it's Eric S. Freeman or some like old school open source people said like open source is about scratching your own itches. If it's not itchy, don't scratch it. I mean, famously, we say Rails is an extraction framework, as in like we don't want feature that you just dreamed of and that you think would be cool. Like the idea you should have like probably tried it in your app or something close to it, and then like you say, hey, I have this use case. I think many other people have.
Yeah.
We build this cool thing. Maybe we could like integrate into Rails. But so it's supposed to work. It's not always like that. Like there's exception, of course. But the idea, and so to me, like I only contribute to open source when I run into a bug or my employer run into a bug. Like it works too, or a performance issue or some limiting features. But I'm not go around implementing stuff nobody needs. Like so, yeah. Sorry, I barely remember your question, but it's really like, yeah, just do what you need. Like solve your own needs.
It's a good takeaway for our listeners and to think about is like you're not, like I think a lot of because people ask me like how do I get started? Like they're asking for advice, right? Because I think that and I don't think you're all that contrarian about that. I think it's a good point of hey, don't do things that's not like luring you, but I think there's like this mystique of like, well, if I want to have a good career, I need to show that I can do some open source contributions.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you really want to, like the one helpful thing, if you just feel like helping the community or whatever, like issue triage and issue fixing, like that, of course, if someone reported a bug they cannot fix themselves and you think you can do it, always useful. But it was really more about like, don't contribute just to contribute, and it's really that makes you feel good, of course. But like, if you're in that mindset, then like, aside from bug fixing and maybe like some small performance optimization or things like that, but nobody is going to accept like a huge refactor just because you felt like contributing. Like it's disruptive, and so I really want to be encouraging about like contributing to open source if you think you should, but don't feel like it's a necessity.
Yeah.
And it's also the best way to burn out. Like you're just gonna make contribution that nobody gonna want to match, and you're gonna say, "Oh,
I'm not gonna do this again." Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
I can appreciate that, and I think you're using your own story there, where you were working on something on Shopify and hitting that race condition, and you needed to debug it, and you weren't going to be able to just rely on you needed to sort the thing out because you needed to fix something in production, I'm assuming, and you wanted to share like, hey, I found this thing and this is what we figured out. And like this, if this gets merged, great. But this is what we did in the meantime. And that's helpful to do that. And so I think if anyone listening out there is working on a project and they're not having those types of problems, don't try to make up problems for yourself to solve, unless it's like there's something that you're rubbing up against. And like, it would be a little smoother if it was like this. I want to try it. And I think that's always been the kind of the ethos in the Rails community is like, don't pitch ideas that you're not going to actually, that other people might not find useful, but prove that it works. It's going to be useful for yourself and not just come up with some hypothetical problem that you may or may not use. So as we kind of wrap up, I have a couple of last questions for you. Is there a software book that you find yourself recommending to people, or something you think fondly of that you think you would recommend other people to check out?
One that really blew me away, but it's because I was starting to dabble into Ruby itself, like the Ruby VM, is crafting interpreters. I think it's free. Like you can read the HTML version or PDF version for free, and it's like absolutely brilliant tutorial-like kind of way of like, oh, I'm gonna create my own language, like an interpreted language. Absolutely brilliant. That really helped me understand better how Ruby works and dabble in it more. So I absolutely recommend. Like best technical read of my career.
Definitely include that in the show notes for everybody. And where's the best place for listeners to follow your work or dig into your writing?
I have a blog. I was off for a few months, so I blogged a lot. I don't know if I'm going to blog much more now that I'm back to work, but we'll see how it goes. So byroad.github.io, I think. And you can follow me on like the various social. So there's like a Blue Sky under Byroad, Ruby Social under Byroad, and on Twitter I got there very late. So it's underscore by root, I believe. Something like that.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. All right, definitely include links to all that in the show notes for everybody. And with that, thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of On Rails. This podcast is produced by the Rails Foundation with support from its core and contributing members. If you enjoyed the ride, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. It helps more folks find the show. Again, I'm Robby Russell. Thanks for riding along. See you next time.